Welcome to episode 2 in this second series of Leading Tourism's Transition, where we focus on futures, foresight and practice, together with Birthe Menke, a PhD Fellow in Sustainable Tourism Development and Tourism Co-Design at the University of Southern Denmark. Well, in the last episode, we spoke with Peter Bishop, where we explored how we can construct different scenarios. And perhaps one of the things that I learned from Peter in that episode is the importance of having a very open mind to what the future might look like, and sometimes considering that we might not consider everything when we look to the future. In this episode, we'll be sitting down with Ian Yeoman, and we'll be looking to 2050. We'll be asking the question, where is tourism headed? As a self-proclaimed crystal ball gazer and futurologist specializing in travel and tourism, there's perhaps nobody better positioned to help us with this question. Ian is a widely acclaimed professor in tourism and has a lot of experience under his belt. We'll be exploring what some of the mega drivers are behind trends, and also looking at some of the disruptors which perhaps take things off track. And we'll be exploring how tourism futures might be shaped by these developments. We'll be looking at perhaps whether there is any chance of having a certain degree of predictability in our confidence about what the future might look like, and perhaps if we're even able to identify ahead of time some of the challenges or possible scenarios that we're likely to face, perhaps even taking us off course or changing the trajectory of things to come. This will be a fascinating conversation where we'll explore a range of opinions, but also lean on fact and some well-established practices to help us understand this better. So if you haven't already subscribed, to make sure you don't miss future episodes, make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and sit back and enjoy. Hello and welcome. So I'm really pleased to be moving into episode 2 of Futures, Foresight and Practice. It's the second series of Leading Tourism's Transition that we've been doing together with Birthe Menke, who has been our excellent guide through the very beginning of this series, where we framed this topic of futures, foresight and practice through 3 different episodes, providing 3 different perspectives. Birthe, it's great to have you back. Today, we will be joined by Ian Yeoman, acclaimed futurologist and professor working in the tourism sector and helping us to navigate futures in our sector. Before we jump straight in, Birthe, let's have a quick introduction. And for those who perhaps haven't had a chance to listen to the first episode, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi, I go by B, but easier for everybody. I'm a PhD student at the University of Southern Denmark. I'm currently in my last of 3 years. And in my research group, we work with co-design methods in tourism quite particularly. And so I started out looking at how tourism practitioners navigate the space between the global SDG strategy in order to get to local tourism action. So how they give meaning to the SDGs in their local contexts. And while researching, it eventually occurred to me that people actually have very little or very poor relationships to the futures that their sustainability efforts are supposed to create. So when it came to sustainability, people were making an effort. At the same time, the visions of what futures that might favor and that might lead to was actually relatively unclear. And so I've moved from sustainability into direction of working with futures in tourism in order to work into the visions that the SDGs propose for the future. And obviously also beyond, because 2030 is actually relatively close at this point.
I find it very exciting that you've made this shift in your research, and this is really something that you've embraced. And certainly in the time that we've collaborated, you've really opened our minds here. And I think many of those that we've worked with into why this is something so important. And as part of that, we're doing this series, and we've selected Ian Yeoman to provide us this perspective, looking towards 2050 and looking at where is tourism headed. Ian, welcome to the show. Before we jump in, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, kia ora. It's good evening from New Zealand. My name is Ian Yeoman. I'm an Associate Professor of Tourism Futures at Victoria University of Wellington and a visiting professor at the European Tourism Futures Institute in Leeuwarden in the Netherlands. And my specialisation and expertise is tourism, but it's where it's going, how it's going to change, what's driving that change. And basically what I do is I create the future, which is from everything from, it's about degrees of certainty to degrees of impossible. It's about co-creation, designing, and what the future will be. And it's fascinating.
Great. Well, we are certainly very, very honored to have your perspective on today's show. Before we jump into the future and see where we can find some sense of predictability, perhaps, Birthe, we can reflect on the first episode that we did together with Peter Bishop, the executive director of Teach the Future. He certainly opened my mind up into the fact that whilst we can predict many things, we also have to consider different scenarios and perhaps even consider the unpredictable. And he left us with a very interesting metaphor. What was your takeaway on that discussion?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of statements that Peter shared that were really simple at the same time really powerful. So the fact that we as humans value certainty, that is a cultural prescription for us to value certainty, but at the same time that we should put effort into also valuing uncertainty, and the fact that we can only as an industry become resilient if we begin giving up on the expectation of what will happen, I think is really part of this attitude that we have to cultivate in order to change the way that we work with the future, and in order to change the way that we work with what's currently part of strategy. And so the metaphor that we ended on, that tourism has historically been about encountering the unknown, Peter elevated in a private discussion after and said that there's that metaphor of the journey that tourism really ought to embrace, and that when traveling, we balance the values of comfort with values of adventure, and that there's opportunity for us now to embrace that on the job.
Yeah, I think there's something that perhaps is so relatable, and it helps us to really connect with this as a topic and think about the need to also get outside of our comfort zone, as we want people to do when they travel and experience places. Perhaps we don't make enough space for that in our day-to-day environments where we're busy strategizing and trying to plan for the future, but perhaps not embracing that sense of adventure and excitement and exploration that we, of course, want people to do when they become travelers. So, Ian, great point to bring you in. I know you've worked with a lot of destinations, in particular, Visit Scotland, and you've tried to introduce the entire concept of futures thinking within the DMO. I'm obviously coming from a tourism and destination background. I'm particularly keen to have your perspective on what happens when you start working with practitioners in the industry and start working with future thinking and bringing that into the day-to-day environment of tourism industry practitioners.
Well, I think there's two things. From my perspective, there's probably two things I do. One's about inspiration, and the second one's about co-creation. Much of the work I do from an inspiration side is about blowing people's socks off. You inspire them with things that they haven't seen or not aware of, and you say this is going to happen, and you give them insight of how it's going to happen and what it's going to happen in the terms of radical change or transformational change in things that are going to do. You inspire through stories, you inspire through facts, you inspire through science fiction. So trying to inspire and innovation and telling a good story is very important, because if people can catch on to that insight, it gives meaning to them. And what you're trying to do is take them beyond what they're thinking of normatively. It's something that's new. It's something that's different. Because I am an expert in the future of tourism, and I have a degree of insight of what's going to come, like any professor in any field. And it's trying to communicate some of the changes that will occur with leaders in tourism. And sometimes that's talking about technological change that's not happening, for example, in tourism. But what could it mean for tourism? So at the moment, we talk about ChatGTP. That's been in the engineering and technology literature for the last 10 to 15 years, but it's now conscious with people and what it means. The other thing to talk about when you move beyond inspiration, is then taking some of those ideas of change and working with practitioners to create futures, to create scenarios across a range of different options, and getting it down to the question, if this is the future that's going to occur or may occur, what does it mean for you? How would you manage that change? What would the implications of change be? So, and a lot of that's workshops, and a lot of that's working with leaders just to ask questions and work things through. So, one is trying to blow their socks off with ideas and innovation and creativity, and the other one's making it practical and working with leaders and stakeholders who can create change in order to drive policy forward or strategy forward, where much of my work lies.
You were just mentioning getting people to move beyond normative thinking. And we touched upon that briefly yesterday as well, that there's always judgment to change, that we have an aversity towards uncertainty and towards, of course, the kind of futures that we think of as undesirable, that we don't want to come true. How do you get people, when you work with people, how do you get them on board towards opening their minds towards the possibility of alternative futures and towards thinking futures through or imagining them through without immediately judging that and shutting the entire process of thinking about futures down?
Well, again, it's when you move beyond the inspiration stuff, there's a realization that change is going to occur. So, for example, we can talk about climate change. Climate change as a science, we've been debating it for 50 years. And probably in the last 2 years, there's a strong realization it's going to happen and what it means. So, last year we did some work with Croatia, for example, looking at what are the two big factors that will shape the future of tourism in Croatia. And the two factors are fundamentally demography and climate change. You've got to think about, Croatia's GDP is all about tourism. It's its number one industry. The second industry is then wine, and then there's a bit of manufacturing. But if you say to them, basically, tourism in your country within 20 years is going to go down the pan. If you say to your country, the present tourism product that you've got, which is the beach, the coast, and sun, it's going to be radically different because Croatia is going to have a 4-degree rise in temperature within 20 to 25 years. And that's IPCC scenario work. And at the same time, it's a country that's going from 4 million people to, by 2050, to around 3 million people. So they're going to lose 25% of their population, according to demography forecasts, because of migration out of the country, because of stronger economies within the European Union. So they're going to lose 25% of their population within 20 to 25 years. So that leads to chaos. But they are facts. And those facts, it's about servicing them and what does it mean when you bring them together in their terms of what they do. So that's one example to work with them. And that becomes the foundation of scenarios. We've also done recently some work with the Ministry of Innovation, Employment and Business here in New Zealand about the future of tourism. And there we talked about how work would change, what would the impacts of technology be. And to me, it's all about Star Trek, the concept of singularity. But then people say it's all about robots, and that's not going to happen. But then you give the examples of the advancement in technology and how it's coming about, like ChatGPT, which is happening. And you get those wow moments. What are the implications in the terms of change? So it just happens and you talk it through. So I like to blow people's socks off, but I always bring it back to reality and practice. These are the innovations that are happening. This is examples of change. And what could it mean? What could it mean for you? Because it's really important, because if you're the managing director of a company or a CEO or a strategic leader, you know the world's not constant. You know the world is going to change. And if you can be ahead of the game and understand that change and what are the implications for tourism or your business, you grapple with that. It's my job, and what I've done in the past is to make sense of the future, but also to help other people make sense of the future in the terms of what are the decisions that they would make, what are the changes that would occur, and how they would go about it.
So, working with different destinations, as you've mentioned, on the subjects and, blowing their socks off, coming back to more practical aspects of working with change. Why do you think, what are arguments why people in tourism context should begin working with faraway futures, even in the present, and what kind of benefits would everyday work practices derive from working differently, more strategically, and more committedly, maybe, with futures?
It's quite simple. Tourism is a very competitive industry. Every country in the world has a Lonely Planet guide. All of the cities of the world have some sort of tourism product. Every rural location I can think of has some sort of tourism office. So everybody does tourism and everybody wants to be part of that tourism pie. But everybody also realizes that what's really important, for example, in the experienced economy, what we have now is innovation and change. New ideas make a lot of difference. And the only way you can grapple with entrepreneurship or innovation or change is by taking the future's perspective. If you ask them to think of the impossible, you get some sort of idea that you can make money out of and can make a profit.
Nick, this actually brings us back to one of the critical concerns from the last episode that, sometimes there's just no time in operational work to entertain many alternatives in everyday work practice. But I think we find an answer, or the beginning to an answer here, that, well, in order to be competitive and successful in the future, we have no other choice than to entertain many ideas of many alternative futures in order to be able to create the kind of experiences that people might be looking for.
Well, there's two things that a lot of the work I'm presently involved is probably with medium-sized companies or destinations where there's a strong realization about strategy and policy. So people tend to take a more long-term thinking perspective. They understand that, the planning for demography, the planning for technology, the spatial planning, and that type of thing, and they want to know where things are going. So that's that at one level. But also at a very micro level, in the terms of business, tourism's the most competitive industry in the world, but it's also the most innovative industry in the world. So they're looking for change. They're looking for what the consumer's looking for. They're looking for new ideas. For example, you can take a trend in demography and then say, how is the consumer changing? What is the consumer doing? Etc., etc. So there's lots there.
It seems to me that if we think about how tourism considers futures, at least from my perspective in that practitioner seat, we're always defined by the pressures that surround us. And those pressures are always very short term, such as being able to present good performance, demonstrate our competitiveness in the immediate future, whether that's a campaign or a branding initiative. Perhaps there's also space in many organizations for mid-term thinking, 2 to 5 year strategy that helps develop a certain initiative or tap into opportunities that are somewhat on the horizon. But the further ahead we look, this seems to get more and more difficult to justify creating that space for futures thinking. And I'm just thinking this because the discussion we're having now is fascinating. But one of the most pressing issues is, of course, the climate crisis. We know that that's an existential issue. You've framed it very eloquently there as well, with some of the other changes that coincide with that. You mentioned the demographic change in Croatia and how that's going to actually change the entire economy. But perhaps something like the climate crisis and sustainability has found its way to be a priority in our day-to-day work because it's set at somewhat a political level as an urgent matter. But I do wonder how we are able to carve that space to work on the many different critical issues which are slightly beyond the horizon and that nonetheless require us to really focus on those. It seems very difficult to be able to justify that and bring back the results from that.
But not everybody has to be involved in long-term futures thinking, and there's no need for that, especially lots of SMEs, lots of businesses that are about operations managers, which is about today's need, the needs in the next 6 months. My work's not fundamentally all about that. My work's about strategic thinking. It's not about operations management. And that's a clear separation. You can only do work, or you should only be involved work in futures thinking where it creates change. And that's about working with the right companies or the right organizations or associations, which is taking that long-term perspective, which is interested in the long-term change. It's not about the unit manager. It's about the managing director, or it's about the policy maker, where a long-term perspective is needed, and it's part of that remit rather than the something at unit level.
Don't you think that to some degree, this should, working with futures and thinking about futures as alternatives that might happen has to happen at every level of an organization, at least to some degree?
Well, it's about preparation, but there's no point in engaging which futures thinking, which is long-term thinking, with people at a unit level or a small business owner, if they're not going to action that change because of the issues around time and resources. They're worried about their business today, their business tomorrow, cash flow, and what it's looking like. What I can do is bring along how society is going to change and what does it mean long term. And my specialization is scenario planning, which is long term thinking. So basically, as an academic or as a policymaker, you can't please everybody all of the time. You can only please some in the terms of where you position yourself and what you do. So I disagree.
Great. There's nothing like a bit of disagreement. I think it's quite interesting to juxtapose this with the previous discussion we've had where we thought about futures as something which needs to open up and bring in more people, more perspectives, more diversity into that mix. And I think it's really interesting to explore these different views on futures. I think certainly I can relate to what Ian is sharing here about the pressures that, if we look at the tourism industry, pressures that SMEs face on a day-to-day basis and what seems to determine their priorities, which is to be profitable, to even continue to stay afloat. And certainly for many businesses that are not invested in their kind of competitiveness, is not invested in being ahead, looking towards the future, they certainly seem to be defined by the short-term priorities, even the mid-term priorities of gaining that competitive position, rather than being involved in something a little bit broader, as we're talking here. So it's an interesting perspective. And I know one of the things that, B, you were keen for us to explore in today's discussion is also this idea around generational perspectives as well. Tell us a little bit more about your thinking there.
So there's been a lot of discussion around, how emergent generations that are just joining the labor market, like Gen Z, for example, are so fundamentally differently wired in why they choose work, what they want to work on, in what intervals they want to work. But there are tensions with current generations that are, in leading positions in a lot of companies globally. How do you think we might be able to leverage the fact that we think differently about the world, that we experience the world differently across generations, and that we simply, work based on different values and different attitudes? Is that something that you're confronted with in your work and that you have had experience working with?
What happens all the time, the whole history of generational thinkings has always been constant. The younger you are, the more radical you are.
Right.
The older you are, the more responsibility you have and the more conservative you have. And if you look at tourism, for example, in New Zealand, your attitudes to life are very different at the age of 15, 25, 45, and 60 in the terms of what you want to do. And it differs from what you buy as a tourist, how you consume as a tourist, and how you engage as a tourist. From a futures perspective, all of the work I do all of the time is about engaging with different attitudes and different value systems. And that's extremely important. So, for example, if you want an opinion of something, somebody that's very opinionated, always ask a hairdresser or always ask a taxi driver, because those two professions always talk because they're in a one-to-one situation with people, especially hairdressers for some reason. And so they're very knowledgeable and very opinionated about things. And they've also got their fingers on the pulse of what people on the street are saying, and what's important, or what value systems are. So that's one perspective. And then the other perspective, when you're constructing scenarios, it's about a multiple view of the world. So that includes generation baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z, different people from males, females, different income groups. So diversity is extremely important because futures work is about stretching opinion and understanding difference. Because when I'm doing futures work, I'm trying to ask the question, what's going to be different and how it's going to change? Because I always say to people, for example, what is ethical today will be different in the terms of ethics tomorrow and how we perceive things. So it's really important to understand those viewpoints, especially if you don't agree with it now. So diversity is very, very important in the terms of what you do.
Yeah, I think that seems to be another one of those things that, just require time. And we're coming back to the subject quite a few times here. The fact that developing multiple and rich, diverse views of the future, or futures in the plural, not only costs time in the process of putting them together, but also in the sense of bringing in enough voices in order to make that future considerate of everything that's going on today.
But today, the role of destination management, DMO, is about understanding change, because destinations as organizations have to understand how demography will change, how the landscape will change, what does sustainability mean, and what do these all mean together, because they're trying to paint a picture of what the future of a destination will be. And if they're saying this is what we need to do, it's then planning for it in the terms of change, capacity, types of tourist, etc., etc., etc. And business then follows, because business is also looking for other people. It's looking to DMOs to say, I want you to make sense of the future. I want you to give me some direction in the terms of where shall we go as a place, or where shall we go as a geography, and what are the trends that will be important and how significant they will be. And one of the classical examples of that has been how the restaurant industry, for example, has changed in the last 20 years, then also how the restaurant industry has changed in the last 5 years. If you look at what the experience economy has done to food tourism, it's been dramatic in the terms of, because we've got more wealth, we're more interested in sustainability. Us as the tourist are more devilish or hedonistic. We want to be excited. So you have to move with the trends in the terms of saying where we're going and what you're doing and what it means. So there's lots out there. And it also comes back to leadership, destination management organizations in the terms of, to a certain extent, it's them that have to lead on resilience. It's them that need to know what are the future shocks that will come and how do you prepare for those shocks in the terms of doing things. Because COVID-19, we all knew about it. We'd had SARS, we'd had MERS, we'd had the Spanish flu. So if we knew the literature from the WHO, any academic in public health, they said it was going to happen. I wrote a paper in 2006 that said SARS will come and we'll be in lockdown for 3 years. And we were in lockdown for 3 years. I said 3 years, and we were in lockdown for 3 years. And it came to a stop. But again, that's the long-term planning. That's the planning in the terms of resilience and taking it forward.
I'll just reflect a little bit on what you were saying about the perspectives that you can get at a local level, for example, through hairdressers, through taxi drivers, because the discourse in tourism has shifted not only to prioritizing and putting sustainability at the very center of everything, but part of that has been providing a voice or finding space to create the involvement of locals into that picture. So when we now talk about tourism and the future of the destination, that invariably now makes space for local residents to be able to also share their views and their ideas on that. It seems something that is quite interesting to gather your thoughts on, because on the one hand, we have tourism experts and practitioners that perhaps can work on future scenarios, can really explore this. And on the other hand, we are also creating space to have ideas, to have people's wishes and desires considered for what their home, what the place they've always lived in might look like or how it might be impacted or changed because of tourism. What are your thoughts on that? Is that the right way to go? I mean, it seems like leadership is a really key role there in order to navigate the conversation in the right way as well.
Yeah. Well, there's two things here. I think you've actually raised a lot of issues there. Because if anybody asks me, what is the future of tourism? I always say, I haven't a clue. What I'm trying to say is I can never predict an exact future, but I can give you a range of futures. Because future studies, foresight methods, Peter Bishop will always talk about this, or James Data. It's always based on the concept of multiplicity or plurality. We can't predict one future, but I can give you several options or several different states. And then from those different futures, you're asking the question, which is the one you prefer, which was the one you think might happen. Each scenario or futures will have a different value system, a different emphasis. So you debate all of these different futures, but you as a DMO or a ministry or a group of business have to make a decision. Considering these four futures, what are the decisions we're going to take? If you've got a scenario which is about disaster, dystopia, you're asking questions, how do you avoid this future? If you've got a future that's very much about utopia, how do you accelerate to that future? So there's a whole range of questions you can work with in order to do that. And that also includes a lot of consultation. That includes very much working with stakeholders of different sizes and different shapes with different levels of power to understand what their viewpoint is and what they think it should be. That involves consultation, participation, and engagement, because there's different ways to use scenarios with different destinations. There's very immersive, talking to lots of people, creating ideas so they have an idea of where they're going, or you just take that top-down approach. So they're all involved in that. So that's one thing that you've raised. The other thing that you've raised is the issue of sustainability. And this is the moment for sustainability and climate change for one reason. Where you have dystopia or disaster, you want hope. Where you have dystopia, you always want a utopian society. So when you're right at the bottom, when you think you can't go any further, the only thing you can think about is what's a better world going to be? And that's been around regenerative tourism, sustainability. What's been at the mindset of strategic leaders is we're right at the bottom. COVID-19's basically destroyed tourism. It stopped it. But it gives us the opportunity to refresh and rethink. So all of the consultation, all of the debate the last 2 years has been about what would tourism look like in a better world. So we had the word regenerative tourism came to mindset, and it became very conscious. And destinations, DMOs, and governments have put sustainability right at the center of the decisions they make. There's nobody not doing sustainability or regenerative tourism or going forward that way to make a better world because of climate change. So one, participation is very important. The other question was, why are we doing sustainability? We're doing sustainability because we've been in a dystopian society and we want a better world.
I guess that nicely brings us to how we design the future. And I know this is something that you've been particularly curious about, Bea.
Yeah, absolutely. So this gets more into the technical aspects of working with futures. Having followed your work a little bit, Ian, you often speak about knowing how to design tourism futures. And I think this part of being open to participatory processes, using the expertise of others who really dive into long-term futures, are already part of that. In this context, you often speak of mega drivers of change, of micro trends, and of disruptors, and maybe to cultivate a language around this in our context. Would you mind explaining what you mean by that?
Well, I could not answer the question and just tell you I've got 2 books coming out later this year about how to design the future of tourism. That's one answer.
All right.
One about scenario planning in tourism, and one about what is the future of global tourism in 2050. So I could just say wait and see. I have a process of what to do, and I'm an expert. What I do constantly is understand the environment. These are the big mega drivers of change, and these are very slow moving. They're not going to change overnight. it's technology, climate change, mobility, humanity, globalization. There's a whole range of, but they're very slow moving. But we know where they'll all go because, for example, demography is a well-rehearsed science, and we make predictions. What will populations look like in 2050, 2075, 2199? And we do birth rates, death rates. So it's a well-known science, and it's the same with climate change. Climate change is modeling. It's a well-rehearsed science. So it's understanding those changes. Then you're asking the question. They're the mega drivers of change. I always ask the question, what does this mean for tourism? So below each mega driver, I have a series of micro trends. And these are examples of what does that mega driver mean from a tourism perspective? If I said wealth, for example, what does wealth mean for luxury tourism? How is luxury redefined? So, for example, luxury, basically, the older you get, the less materialistic you become. Females are more interested in experiences and enrichment compared to men who want a fast car. So if you can understand, for example, the concepts of demography by age group, by sexuality, and by wealth, you can then say, for example, and if you look at visitor profiles to a destination, you can then segment by all of these, and you can say, what would luxury look like, and what it would look in the country, and what would it do? You can also look at climate change, for example. Different generations have different perceptions of climate change in different value systems. Different age groups and different sexes have different degrees of activism and voice in the terms of doing things. So you can take the mega driver and then say, what does it mean at a more local level? What does it mean for tourism in the terms of purchase? Or what does it mean for a whole range of different things? So I constantly monitor that, and I get a lot of my data from the UN agencies, the World Bank. For example, the Asian Development Bank does loads of statistics and stuff. I also call upon consumer thinking houses for the micro trends, people like Euromonitor or the Foresight Factory, who do a lot of this micro trend data. So I take all of that, and that's my constant bundle of trends. The next thing I ask the question is, somebody comes along to me and says, I want you to tell me, or I want to understand what the future of tourism will be, or what the future of sustainable tourism will be, or how will technology change tourism? So I then take all of those trends, or the specific ones, and we do workshop work, and we decide that what are the most important trends that will shape sustainability or technology, and we create a number of scenarios, and those scenarios are basically based upon different understandings. So one understanding is something very predictive. It's taking the trend data and just extrapolating it into the future based upon normative thinking. Another scenario would be very much about science fiction, transformation, very radical, where the trend line would go very wobbly or just off the curve. Very, very different. We'd have another scenario about utopia, about collapse and rebound. So it's the dystopia, utopian alternative world. And we'll probably have another scenario about it's not going to happen, but it's probably going to happen. We talk about that normative continuation, but some sort of diversity of that. So we'd have 4 different worlds. And with in those 4 different worlds, we tend to fill the matter or create a story different ways. So, for example, recently did some work for Wellington on a Plate, which is the local food festival, and they were asking the question, what will the food festival look like in the future? And we looked at the variables. What would the value system of the consumer be? What would they be eating? What wouldn't they be eating? And then extrapolating that out into what would be the type of events that they would go to within a festival, and what would be the philosophy of different scenarios. So we had one focus on the role of science in food festivals, one looking at the role of well-being, one looked at the role of community, and one looked at the role of authenticity.
What do we then do with the scenarios? How can we use the scenarios to create action or to at least make them real?
Well, that goes back to right at the beginning. You were asking me questions earlier. Future studies foresight is not for everybody. It's about working with people that can make decisions about the future, who've got the resources and the political ability to create change. And that's why when you're doing this work and this foresight work you've got to engage with those people that can create change in order to action change. Because it's about trends, scenarios, actions, and strategy. So it's a linear model. You're creating foresight of what's to come in order for people to action the future and respond to that. So it's about doing something with it. Do not do foresight work or futures work if you're just going to write a report. Nobody's going to read it and it's going nowhere. It's got to have that output to deliver change. There's a couple of exceptions for that. I once did a project where, for example, in government, they do a lot of consultation. So sometimes they just want you to paint the picture of what the future is going to be. And in policy perspectives, you then send to the policymakers, what does this scenario mean for you? If this was the future, what would be the actions or decisions you would take now in order to prepare for that future or prevent that future? And you're letting them come up with the answers and the strategy, depending what you're doing and what the client wants and what the parameters are. But fundamentally, I have an expertise on how different trends interact with each other. It's not just demography or technology, it's about what they mean altogether. You're painting a picture about the future and people at a very high level to understand that future in order to be aware of change and change is necessary for them to action change.
Do you think that destinations or DMOs rather should be the ones assuming that responsibility and that agency then? The destination, this DMOs, as you mentioned, the people who ought to understand what is going on a grander scale and help businesses in their local context.
It has to be that. It all depends on the level of the DMO because it all depends on the resources of the DMO. Some DMOs or destinations are very small. It can be several villages joined together, or it can be a big city, or it can be a region or a country. So it all depends on the size and the level of futures thinking that they're wanting to do. But fundamentally, at least at a country level or a big city level, futures thinking is very important, because it's all about planning and foresight to create change. If I'm saying to visit Scotland or visit New Zealand or Australia or Californian Tourism Authority, that your destination has the potential to grow by 200% in the next 15 years. So, for example, if they move from, say, 5 million international arrivals to 15 million international arrivals, what would it mean? It's something you just can't go out and plan for because it needs an integrated approach. It may mean a new airport. It needs something to do with sewage. It needs spatial planning. There's issues around supply and capacity. What would the labor force look like? So, one of the things about scenario planning or futures thinking, it's not just about tourism, but one of the things I've learned, it's a way to bring different stakeholders together from different agencies in order to plan for the future and work together.
So this idea of leadership is really, really crucial then if we consider that perspective, because the destination is traditionally, and I know this is something that has been debated endlessly for the last 10 years or so, this question of marketing or management. But I think it seems that it goes far above both, in fact, because it's not about marketing or management, is it? It's about the vision for where the destination should position itself as a place, how it should be branded and positioned from a sense of values and competitiveness. But beyond that, it's also about the infrastructure and the capacity of everything from the sort of hard infrastructure, physical infrastructure, right down to the people and their willingness and their desire to welcome and create that kind of destination that is defined, at least in part, by tourism.
That's right. I started off in scenario planning and futures work in 2008 with Visit Scotland, and I was a bit of an oddball. There was 300 people working for the agency. Here's this guy, that's the futures work. And my boss always used to say to me, I want you to scare me, and I want you to scare the organization. I want you to talk about West Nile virus, foot and mouth disease, avian flu, because I really want you to scare them. Because at one point, one of those will arrive, and we ask the question, what does it mean for us in the terms of preparation? So he wanted me to scare people, and I did that. The other things were, if you're going to scare them, he wanted you to talk about what does it mean, how can we prepare for it, and what would be the actions we could do. So making sense of this scary world. The other thing I've always done in the terms of futures work is a good way to bring multiple stakeholders together from different agencies, because tourism is not just the Ministry of Tourism. Tourism is also about transport, the environment, workforce planning. So one of the roles that we had within Visit Scotland was strategic leadership, to paint a picture of the future so people could buy into the future and work more collaboratively. The other things that we did at Visit Scotland were what I called ad hoc projects. People wanted to know where things would go. So, for example, in 2008, we had a lot of eyesights across Visit Scotland of visitor centres. And you're asking the question, where will the visitor centre go? What will the impact of the mobile phone be? And how will the mobile phone or information technology change how the tourist seeks information? There was a drive in Visit Scotland to put more money into product development, particularly food tourism. There was a realization they wanted to drive up the quality of the food tourism product. And again, you're doing scenarios to talk about why you need to change, what food will look like in the future. If you don't change, what would happen? That type of thing. 2008, 2009, we were talking about climate change and sustainability. It's an issue that wasn't seen as important, more of a marketing agency. But again, you're driving that concept of what does it mean? It's a long-term driver of change. So I think the role I had as scenario planner at Visit Scotland helped the agency make sense of the future, and it created a lot of leverage or brownie points externally, because the organization was showing leadership and how change could occur, and they use that as a leverage. It's also a good media outlet. I was in the Daily Mail, I was in the Daily Record, the Scotsman. There was always a story about the future of tourism, whether it was good or bad, but it also created a good press in the terms of communications in different aspects, in doing different things. So that was always a good media story. It was fun.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what we've been discussing seems to be also about having fun doing this, being playful, being exploratory. Yeah, exploring ideas which are perhaps staying safe around things that we can predict based on statistics and data and forecasting, but also things we really can't predict, but we can imagine. So I guess to sort of conclude today's discussion, Birthe, you've been quite familiar with how the tourism industry is picking up these methods of working and witnessing it as both a fly in the wall, but you also have had some opportunities to facilitate some futures thinking and perhaps seen how people respond to that when it's maybe the first time they've been able to get into the zone there. What excites you and also what concerns you from everything that you've been able to observe through this?
I think one aspect is definitely that when first confronted with the question of where might we be headed, a lot of people get really reluctant. Nobody wants to be the one putting the word out there and having, said out loud the radical ideas or even the more gentle ideas. I think cultivating a sense of working with how things might be different can be an exciting thing to do, because once you're in a position to assume that agency, once you have people you work with that have that agency to bring change to, let's say, policy, strategy, action on a grander scale, I think then it gets really exciting. We've had small bits of interventions and experiments that we did with people where they've come out of these sessions and they've said, this was so fun. It was so fun to put my head out there and to use a different set of resources that I, as a human being, already bring to the table and use them in a different way. And I think, as Peter said in the first session, it is an innate capacity that we have to think about the future. And then, bringing Ian's perspective in on how strategically we're actually able to do that, then I think there is a way for us to get on board and to join those who already have visions of the future and contribute to that with our everyday practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a strong note to end on. And I think it really helps us to understand that we all have this capacity within us. Perhaps this doesn't form everybody's role. Not everybody is necessarily mandated or even has the space within their day-to-day pressures to do this. But we certainly all seem to have the capacity and that creativity to bring to that. So thank you, Ian, for your excellent contribution to this series. I think you've really helped us gain a different perspective. And I think also a grasp of realism when it comes to how we can consider the role of leadership and also the way in which to create the right structure to be able to bring about change through leadership. Well, that was certainly a lot to digest, and perhaps if we think about what we've discussed so far in episodes 1 and 2 of the series, we can certainly see diverging opinions on how we might think about the future. The first took us to look at a great deal of openness to how things might sometimes change the course of what the future looks like, and how we need to consider different scenarios. In this most recent discussion, we also looked at those factors that really drive trends and drive change, and how we can better prepare ourselves to work, embrace, and perhaps even maximize the potential of things that we can already see coming. In the next episode, I'll be sitting down with Birthe to reflect on some of the things that we've discussed so far, but also share some first-hand perspectives about what all of this looks like when we put it into practice. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and stay tuned. Make sure you hit subscribe, and we'll see you in episode 3.